Meghan also denied being the leading player in the couple's decision to relinquish their senior royal status and pursue their own life and goals in the relative privacy of their new California home.
Stop. Before you scroll past this, I need you to understand something. What I'm about to show you was discovered 47 minutes ago. Not 47 hours, not 47 days, 47 minutes. And in those 47 minutes, 3 emergency calls have been placed to Buckingham Palace. King Charles has canceled his afternoon schedule. William has gone dark. No public appearances, no statements, nothing. A storage unit in California, rented under a shell company, locked for 4 years, and this morning, just this morning, someone opened it. Inside, they didn't find old clothes, bims. They didn't find forgotten furniture. They didn't find memorabilia. They found something the palace has been desperately searching for since 2020. Evidence, recordings, documents, letters in handwriting that's been silent for 27 years, and one item sitting at the bottom of the 6th box that changes everything we thought we knew about why Harry and Meghan really left. I'm going to show you exactly what's inside. I'm going to walk you through each box, each discovery, each moment when the people in that room realized they weren't just doing an inventory check. They were documenting the evidence that could end the monarchy as we know it. But first, I need to ask you one question, and I need you to really think about your answer. What would you keep if you knew no one would ever believe your story? Because Meghan kept everything, and now the world is about to find out why. The discovery. November 29th, 6:30 a.m. The California sky was still wrapped in that soft gray dawn light when a single phone call set off a cascade of consequences that would ripple across 2 continents. The call came from a storage facility near Montecito. You know the kind, tucked away on a narrow road, designed to be invisible, unnoticed. The kind of place where retirees store downsized belongings, where families keep things between moves. Nothing remarkable, nothing noteworthy. Until that morning, the facility manager, a man who'd worked there for over 20 years without a single incident, made an urgent call to the legal representative overseeing a court-requested inventory check. His voice was clipped, tense. The words he spoke next would trigger an international crisis. "We opened the unit. You need to come now." Think about that for a moment. What could be inside a storage unit that would warrant that level of urgency? What could possibly require immediate legal attention? Within 40 minutes, 2 unmarked vehicles pulled into that gravel lot, their tires crunching over stones still wet from coastal fog. Then a 3rd vehicle arrived, tinted windows, a single passenger inside. Someone later confirmed to have ties to a high-level private security firm, the kind that protects celebrity clients when discretion isn't just preferred, it's essential. Why would a storage unit require that level of security? The unit had been rented nearly 4 years earlier, shortly after Meghan and Harry relocated to California. For 4 years, it had remained mostly inactive, accessed only by individuals who arrived irregularly, usually in the late evening or early morning hours. Nothing suspicious, nothing that raised red flags. But inside palace circles, this storage unit had been an open secret, a growing concern, a ticking time bomb. Because from the very beginning, from the earliest days of the Sussex departure, there had been rumors, persistent, quiet, never fully dismissed. Rumors that Meghan had kept certain materials from her time within the royal household, not just personal belongings, but items that carried weight. Items that, under the right circumstances, or the wrong ones, could rewrite narratives, reignite scandals, extensions the palace had spent years trying to bury. At 7:00 a.m., as that cold fluorescent light spilled across the concrete floor, the truth stopped living in rumor. It lived in boxes, stacks of them, heavy ones, labeled ones, unlabeled ones, and at least 5 marked in thick black pen with dates stretching back to 2018, 2019, and the early months of 2020. Does that timeline sound familiar? It should. Those were the months when everything changed for the Sussexes, the months when tensions reached a breaking point, the months when private conversations turned into public warfare. By 7:00 a.m., word began to spread, not to the public, not yet, but through private channels that carried more influence than any broadcast network. Calls moved quietly from Los Angeles to New York, from Washington to London. And inside the Royal Communications Office at Buckingham Palace, a senior advisor reviewing morning reports paused when he saw the flagged alert. 3 words that rarely appeared unless the implications were profound. Preliminary contents significant. The palace awakens. Within 30 minutes, the message reached Kensington Palace. William's private secretary read it twice, then forwarded it directly to the Prince of Wales, who was preparing for a scheduled briefing. When William saw the subject line, he stopped mid-page. His expression tightened into that familiar seriousness, the look that's come to define him during moments of unexpected turbulence. He didn't ask what was found. He asked, "How long do we have until someone else does?" That question tells you everything you need to know about what's really at stake here. This isn't about embarrassment. This isn't about scandal. This is about control, about narrative, about who gets to tell the story of what really happened behind those palace walls. And right now, for the first time in decades, the monarchy has lost control of that narrative. Across Buckingham Palace, King Charles received the news differently. He'd just finished early morning updates when his senior advisor approached with the briefing. Charles, already weary from weeks of strained family dynamics, closed his eyes briefly before responding. What did they find? The advisor hesitated. You need to understand, these are people trained in diplomatic language, in careful phrasing, in never revealing more than necessary. But even he couldn't mask the gravity. We don't know yet, sir, but there were documents and recordings. Recordings! Let that word sink in for a moment. The word echoed through that room like a warning bell. Because documents can be disputed. Documents can be contextualized, reframed, explained away. But recordings? Recordings are irrefutable. Meghan's reaction. Nearly 5,000 miles away, in the Montecito foothills, Meghan herself was informed. She was standing beside a kitchen window overlooking the hazy morning landscape when she received the message. The reaction was immediate. A stillness, a deep inhalation, and a single whispered response. Already. Not what, not how, not who authorized this. Already. As if she'd been waiting, as if she'd known this moment would come, as if she'd been preparing for it since the day she left Britain. Because here's what the public doesn't understand. Meghan and Harry knew this could happen. They'd known from the beginning. But knowing something might happen and watching it actually unfold, those are 2 very different experiences, and nothing prepared them for how fast it would move. Inside the first box. They opened the first box at exactly 9:22 a.m. No one spoke as the lid lifted. Even the overhead lights seemed to dim, as though the storage unit itself recognized the gravity of what was being revealed. Inside, leather-bound journals, neatly arranged, each wrapped in protective archival paper. On the topmost journal, in Meghan's unmistakable looping handwriting, Winter Notes, 2019. Let me remind you what was happening in 2019. That was the year the fractures began to show publicly. The year internal conversations turned sharp. The year rumors of tensions between the Fab Four, William, Kate, Harry, and Meghan, went from whispers to headlines. The year everything shifted beneath everyone's feet. The inventory team exchanged looks, measured, cautious, professional. But beneath that surface calm, everyone understood what journals from that period could contain. Personal reflections, sensitive accounts, descriptions of meetings that had been reduced publicly to two-line palace statements. Whatever was inside these pages, someone had once believed they were worth preserving, far from British soil. But it was the second layer of that box that truly changed everything. Flash drives. Not one, not two. An entire row of them, each labeled only with a month and a year. No descriptions, no summaries, no hints. January 2020, February 2020, March 2020. Do you recognize those months? Those were the months leading to the infamous announcement. The months when Harry and Meghan were negotiating their exit. The months when palace staff whispered in corridors. When William and Harry were reportedly barely speaking. When Charles was privately urging unity, even as the institution braced for impact. And beside those drives, several sealed envelopes, each embossed with the royal crest. Let me emphasize this. Envelopes bearing the royal crest are not given lightly. They represent official palace correspondence. They're meant to exist within palace walls, archived, protected, controlled. They are never meant to sit in a California storage unit. One envelope bore a handwritten note. Private correspondence, keep secure. That phrase alone would trigger alarm anywhere. Inside a storage unit? It was a crisis. The team lead made the call within seconds. This was no longer an inventory check. This was a high-level breach. Within minutes, the information reached London again, this time in sharper detail. The first report had used the word significant. The second report used a different word, urgent. By early afternoon in the United Kingdom, the palace's crisis communications group had assembled in their underground briefing room, a space used only when the stakes are too high for standard protocol. Phones were swept, devices removed, doors locked. The head of communications read aloud the preliminary summary transmitted from California. When he reached the line referencing leather-bound journals and royal crest envelopes, the room fell utterly silent. A senior advisor broke that silence with the question everyone feared. What if these contain private conversations, internal disputes, disagreements we never addressed publicly? Another advisor responded with the nightmare scenario they'd all been avoiding. Then we will face a narrative we cannot control. The weight of evidence. When Princess Anne was briefed later that afternoon, she listened without interruption. Arms crossed, expression unreadable. But those who knew her well recognized the subtle tightening of her jaw, a sign of rising concern. Not at Meghan specifically, but at the chaos this moment could unleash. Anne has weathered decades of royal upheaval. She's watched scandals flare, fade, and reappear. She's seen how swiftly a private story becomes a public problem. But these documents, stored abroad, preserved deliberately, discovered accidentally, were something entirely different. They suggested intention, planning, a long game. Her first question was sharp. "Does Harry know?" The advisor hesitated. "We believe he will shortly." Anne exhaled slowly, as if bracing herself for a storm she'd sensed coming for years. By mid-morning in California, the second box was opened. If the first box had been concerning, this one was explosive. Inside were folders, each organized with meticulous care. These weren't haphazard collections of memories. These were curated records, deliberate, intentional, immediately recognizable to anyone familiar with the internal machinery of the royal household. Because these weren't simply Meghan's belongings. These were palace documents, copies of schedules, meeting summaries, internal briefing notes, some stamped private, some marked confidential, others bearing the initials of senior household officials. The inventory team paused, unsure whether to continue without additional authorization. But the instructions from the supervising attorney were clear. Catalog everything. Photograph everything. Do not interpret. Do not speculate. Still, speculation seeped into that room like fog. One folder stood out before it was even opened. A thick packet labeled Commonwealth Discussions, Winter 2019. Personal annotations included. That phrase, personal annotations included, sent a ripple of alarm through secure channels back to London. Why? Because winter 2019 was one of the tensest periods of the Sussex era. It was filled with private negotiations, shifting expectations, and disagreements over Meghan's emerging role within the Commonwealth project, a project the palace had hoped she would champion, a way of integrating her heritage, her global appeal, and the monarchy's long-term vision. But here's the uncomfortable truth the public never fully saw. Behind closed doors, the initiative became a point of friction, not unity. And now, in a California storage unit, sat records from those conversations that might reveal who supported Meghan's ideas, who resisted them, and who attempted to reshape the narrative entirely. But what truly changed the atmosphere was the discovery beneath those folders. A slim black recording device, not new, not cutting edge, an older model, one easy to conceal, easy to overlook, easy to underestimate. It had been stored without batteries, wrapped carefully in cloth, placed beside labeled USB drives the team hadn't yet processed. The label beside it read, 2019 notations, not recordings, not transcripts, not audio logs. Notations. The team lead froze. Everyone in that room understood instantly what that might imply. Were these recordings of conversations, voice memos, personal reflections, or the scenario no one dared articulate, private palace meetings captured for personal protection? Think about that. What would drive someone to record conversations within the royal household? Fear? Self-preservation? Evidence gathering? Or the simple, desperate need to prove that what you experienced actually happened? The Diana connection. For a long moment, no one in the California storage unit moved. The third box sat open, its contents spread across the table, like the aftermath of a secret history spilling into daylight. But it was one item, one single envelope, that transformed a troubling discovery into an absolute crisis. An envelope bearing Diana's unmistakable handwriting, curved, elegant, instantly recognizable to anyone who remembers her. The inventory team froze, each person aware they were looking at something that should not, by any measure of logic or protocol, be here. Diana's handwriting, in a storage unit belonging to Meghan Markle, in Montecito, in late November 2025. The supervising attorney approached it carefully, lifting it with the deliberate stillness usually reserved for objects far older, far rarer, far more volatile. There was no date on the outside, no subject line, just a name, Meghan. And that was enough to send a shockwave across the Atlantic faster than any official memorandum. Because the palace knew Diana's correspondence had been archived meticulously, tracked, catalogued, studied, sealed. For a letter to appear now, one the institution had never acknowledged, could only mean one thing. Someone had saved it privately. Someone had passed it privately. And someone had ensured it reached Meghan. By early afternoon, Pacific time, a fourth urgent alert reached Buckingham Palace. Charles, already shaken by the earlier message about recordings, read the new briefing while standing in his private study. The winter light outside was dim, weak, casting long shadows across old furniture. When he reached the line referencing a sealed envelope in Diana's hand, he stopped breathing for half a second. He whispered only one word: impossible. Because Charles knew Diana had been many things: charismatic, defiant, emotional, brilliant, but careless was never one of them. If she wrote to someone, it was intentional. If she preserved something, it had purpose. And if she passed something meant for the future, it carried meaning. He sank into a chair, rubbing the bridge of his nose while his advisor stood silently nearby. The king looked not frightened, but heartbroken. "Not Meghan," he murmured. "Why Meghan?" William received the update minutes later. His reaction was quieter, steadier, but unmistakably grim. Diana's legacy is the one thing William guards fiercely, sometimes protectively, sometimes possessively, but always with profound loyalty. The idea that a private letter from her had been circulating outside palace knowledge, outside archival preservation, outside the family entirely, that pierced something deeper than duty. When his private secretary finished reading the briefing, William asked a single question: "Has Harry seen it?" The answer was no. But the question itself revealed the center of the storm now forming. If the letter reached Meghan after Diana's death, Harry must have been involved, or must have known someone who was. If it reached Meghan before Harry even met her, the implications are staggering. The California team continued cataloging. Beneath the envelope in Diana's hand were letters from senior palace figures, some warm, some cautious, some unreadable in tone. Notes regarding early assessments, press strategies, private reassurances from certain advisors, and one particularly jarring item, a printed transcript from a phone conversation between two palace officials discussing Meghan's public reception during her first months in the family. The final line read, "She will need to be managed carefully." Managed, not supported, not guided, not welcomed. Managed. The room grew colder as they read it, because this was no longer a story of a difficult duchess or a strained family dynamic. This was the beginning of a pattern the world had suspected, a pattern the palace had always denied, a pattern that now lived in black and white on a sheet of paper sealed for years. One of the attorneys whispered under his breath, "This is bigger than we thought." He was wrong. It was far bigger. The binders of truth. The fifth box was heavier than the others, not physically, emotionally. Everyone felt it the moment their hands touched the cardboard. Something about its weight, its density, its deliberate organization suggested this was not another set of files or journals. This was a box of intention. At 10:48 a.m., they lifted the lid. Inside, stacked neatly like artifacts awaiting a museum curator, were binders marked with date ranges, each covering specific windows of Meghan's time inside the royal household. The earliest, summer 2017, introduction period. Then, autumn 2017, pre-engagement notes. 2018, public transition. 2009, internal correspondence. 2020, exit negotiations. Like chapters of a story, the public believed they already understood. Except none of this was the palace's version. These were Meghan's, her notes, her records, her preservation of the truth as she experienced it. The supervising attorney opened the first binder. Inside were laminated copies of press briefings, internal emails, and pages of Meghan's handwritten annotations filling the margins in careful, controlled script. Certain phrases were underlined aggressively, others circled, some marked with stars, a few annotated with short, devastating comments. Not accurate. This was said privately, not publicly. Why is the narrative shifting? Can you imagine keeping those records? Can you imagine sitting in your new home in California, carefully documenting every discrepancy between what was said privately and what was presented publicly? What would drive someone to do that? Trust or the complete absence of it? But the binder that stalled everyone, that made even the cameras feel intrusive, was labeled 2019 Communications Review. Inside were printed screenshots of private WhatsApp groups among staff, Slack messages, internal summaries of media tone, correspondence about handling the growing public tension surrounding Meghan's coverage. No one expected what they found halfway through. A thread between two senior palace aides, dated late autumn 2019, discussing strategic adjustments to Meghan's press visibility. One message read, "She is drawing too much focus again. We need to redirect the narrative." Another responded, "We have options. Keep this quiet." The team lead whispered, "This is the kind of language that starts inquiries." But the most jarring discovery came next. A folder containing prepared drafts of statements the palace never released. Some softened Meghan's image, some clarified misinformation, some defended her outright. None had been issued. Instead, the public only saw silence. Think about what that means. Statements were written, defenses were prepared, clarifications were drafted, and then nothing. The palace chose silence, while Meghan faced an avalanche of criticism, speculation, and outright lies. Why? What calculation led to that decision? And more importantly, how did it feel to be Meghan, knowing those statements existed but would never see the light of day? The sixth box. The sixth box was smaller than the others, almost unassuming, tucked against the back wall of the storage unit, as though it had been placed there last, perhaps even reluctantly. But the label on the front was unmistakable. It was Harry's handwriting, untidy, rushed, uneven in pressure, the script of a man who had always carried too much emotion in his grip. It read, "Private, do not open without me." The supervising attorney hesitated. This was the first box that presented a human dilemma rather than a legal one. At 11:59 a.m., they opened it. Inside were folders, but unlike Meghan's meticulously organized binders, Harry's materials were scattered, inconsistent. Some pages dog-eared, others marked with smudges or hastily scribbled notes. This was not archival preservation. This was heartbreak in paper form. The first folder they lifted was labeled William 2014 to 2020. The room went still. Inside were printouts of messages exchanged between the brothers during the period when Harry's anxiety was worsening, when public attention was becoming suffocating, and when Meghan had not yet entered the picture. Messages filled with warmth, with annoyance, with brotherly teasing, but also later messages lined with tension. One page was marked with Harry's handwriting. This is when it changed. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine your own sibling documenting the exact moment your relationship fractured? Not with anger, not with blame, just with heartbroken precision. This is when it changed. Beneath that folder lay another, Father. Inside were letters Harry had written to Charles, some never sent, some with Charles's responses attached. These were not political documents or strategic communications. These were personal. A son reaching for a father he felt slipping away. A father struggling to balance love with duty. One line, written in Harry's hand, was circled 3 times. I can't be the spare if the role costs me myself. Let that sentence sit with you for a moment. I can't be the spare if the role costs me myself. That's not a prince complaining about his position. That's a human being fighting for his identity, his mental health, his survival. And he wrote it to his father, hoping, desperately hoping, that someone would understand. But it was the envelope at the bottom of the box that silenced the room entirely. Plain, unmarked, sealed not with tape, but with wax, red wax, the imprint, a single letter, D. Diana. No one spoke as the attorney lifted it. No one breathed as he examined the seal. No one dared suggest opening it without authorization, because this was not just a relic. This was a message. Whether Diana wrote it years ago and saved it for her sons, or whether it had been part of another legacy passed to Harry after her death, the meaning was unmistakable. It belonged to a mother, a future king, and the son who had spent his entire adult life trying to understand the wounds she left behind. The reckoning. At that same moment, across the ocean, the palace was unraveling in ways no one could contain. Inside Kensington Palace, William received confirmation that Harry's box contained personal correspondence. His shoulders stiffened, his jaw set, and for the first time since this crisis began, an expression of grief, not anger, crossed his face. Because whatever those documents held, they would tell Harry's story in his own words, unfiltered, unedited, unprotected by the palace machinery. And William knew what that meant. Harry had not just preserved memories, he had preserved evidence. Evidence of the closeness they once had, evidence of the distance that grew between them, evidence of the choices that pushed them onto diverging paths. At Clarence House, Charles responded with something between heartbreak and resignation, a father's sorrow, not a king's. He understood now that the California discovery was not an attack. It was not a threat. It was a record of what the monarchy had asked of its sons, a record of failures on all sides, a record of years spent trying and failing to hold a family together while holding a kingdom upright. Princess Anne, briefed last, responded in the only way she knew how, with clarity. Her words were blunt, brutal, true. This is the moment we feared, not because of the scandal, because of honesty. Anne understood what others were still processing. The monarchy doesn't fear gossip. It doesn't fear headlines. It fears receipts. And California was full of them. Back in California, Meghan stood alone in her kitchen, hands resting lightly against the counter as she listened to the update. The attorney told her Harry's box had been opened despite the warning written on its lid. She nodded slowly, not with surprise, with acceptance. She whispered, "Then the truth was always going to surface." But then the attorney asked about the inventory list. "Is this everything?" There was a pause, a long one. Then Meghan said something that changed the entire trajectory of this crisis. "There's one more thing. In Harry's box, at the very bottom. They haven't reached it yet." "What is it?" Another pause, longer this time. His timeline, month by month, of every conversation he tried to have before we left, every person he reached out to, every time he asked for help. The attorney's voice dropped. Why would he document that? Meghan's answer was soft, measured, devastating. Because no one believed him then, and he knew no one would believe him later. The truth that changes everything. So, here we are, in a storage unit in California, surrounded by boxes that tell a story the world thought it already knew. Except we didn't know. We knew the headlines, we knew the official statements, we knew the carefully managed narrative the palace has been feeding us for years. But we didn't know the truth. The crisis unfolding isn't about documents or recordings or even private letters from Diana. It's about something far more profound. The moment when institutional control meets personal truth. For decades, centuries, the monarchy has survived by controlling the narrative, by choosing silence over explanation, by relying on dignity, discretion, and the public's willingness to accept that some things are better left unsaid. But what happens when the people who lived that story decide to preserve their own version? What happens when journals, recordings, and carefully documented timelines exist outside palace walls? What happens when the spare and the woman who married him decide that their truth matters more than institutional comfort? Here are the questions you should be asking right now. Why did Meghan feel the need to preserve evidence? People don't document conversations unless they fear they won't be believed. They don't keep recordings unless they anticipate denial. They don't organize binders of palace correspondence unless they're building a defense. Against what? Why did Harry keep a timeline of every conversation he tried to have? That level of documentation suggests desperation. It suggests someone reaching out repeatedly, being dismissed repeatedly, and finally deciding that one day, maybe years later, he would need proof that he tried, that he wasn't silent, that he wasn't complicit, that he asked for help and was refused. Why does a letter from Diana, written decades ago, matter in 2025? Because Diana understood something the institution still refuses to acknowledge, that the cost of royal duty can be measured in human suffering. If she wrote something meant for Meghan, it means she saw the pattern. She recognized the machinery, and she tried to warn someone who would face it decades later. What happens next? That's the question keeping the palace awake tonight. Because once this story breaks, and it will break, the monarchy faces something it has never successfully navigated. A counter-narrative backed by evidence. Not speculation, not gossip, evidence. But beyond the institutional crisis, beyond the headlines, beyond the constitutional implications, there's something else in those boxes. Pain. Human pain. Carefully documented, meticulously preserved, sealed away in a storage unit, because the people who experienced it couldn't trust that anyone would believe them otherwise. That's what changes everything. Not the scandal, not the revelations, but the recognition that behind every palace statement every denial, every call for privacy, there were two people, Harry and Meghan, trying desperately to tell a truth no one wanted to hear. And now that truth lives in boxes, undeniable, unavoidable, unstoppable. So, what do we do with this information? Do we dismiss it as another chapter in the Sussex drama? Do we side immediately with the palace? Or with Harry and Meghan based on our existing biases? Or do we do something harder? Do we sit with the discomfort of realizing that the story we've been told might not be the whole story? That's the challenge these boxes present, not just to the monarchy, to all of us. Because if Meghan and Harry felt they needed to preserve evidence of their experience, what does that say about how we, the public, the media, the institution, treated them while they were trying to survive? The final question, Ive. Minutes ago, they opened Meghan's storage unit in California. What's inside changes everything. But the real question isn't what's in those boxes. The real question is, what are we going to do now that we know? Are we going to listen, really listen? Or are we going to do what the institution has done for years? Dismiss, deflect, and hope the storm passes? Because this time, I don't think it will. This time, the truth has a timeline. It has recordings. It has annotations in the margins of palace documents. This time, the truth has evidence, and that changes everything. The boxes in California are still being cataloged. The palace is still scrambling to contain the fallout. And somewhere in Montecito, Meghan and Harry are bracing for what comes next. Because they know what we're only beginning to understand. The truth was always going to surface. It was only ever a question of when. And now, we have our answer. 5 minutes ago. What do you think is in Diana's sealed letter? What would you have preserved if you were in Meghan's position? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if this video made you see this story differently, hit that subscribe button, because this is just the beginning. The palace wants this story to disappear. We're going to make sure it doesn't.